Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Atlantic Book Talk. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg, I'm the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and Bart Gellman is with us today, author of this great new book, Dark Mirror, about Edward Snowden. I'm glad you're all with us. Welcome to this latest digital event cast. We seem to be doing 2 or 3 a day, or that's just me who seems to be doing 2 or 3 a day. But they're great, and it's a great way to connect with our readership. We're very, very grateful that our readers, new and old readers, have been turning to The Atlantic in unprecedented numbers for our coverage of the coronavirus pandemic and all of the related subjects. We're going to talk to Bart today. The subject kind of infiltrates every conversation we have. I'm sure it will in some way, but we really want to focus on the Snowden case, privacy, surveillance, security, obviously relevant subjects any day of the week. Bart will join us in a moment for this conversation. But first, I want to thank our partners at the Century Foundation for working on this event with us. Century Foundation has been Bart's writing home and researching home for quite a while. And I want to introduce Mark Zuckerman, who is the president of the Century Foundation.
Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to join Jeffrey Goldberg and The Atlantic in co-sponsoring today's talk with my friend Bart Gellman, a distinguished senior fellow at the Century Foundation. For the past several years, Bart has been painstakingly researching and writing this remarkable new book, Dark Mirror. Dark Mirror, of course, is about Ed Snowden and the American surveillance state. It analyzes and further reveals the shocking collection practices of the federal government. This book is worth the wait in every way. I couldn't put it down. It's a thrilling read. It reminded me of another classic, All the President's Men. In Dark Mirror, Bart methodically unravels layers of government deceit and misrepresentation. He provides the backstory of Ed Snowden's own evolution from behind-the-scenes intelligence techie to outlaw and civil liberties icon. But the book is also about the inside story of investigative reporting told with high drama. Bart takes you deep inside his tense negotiations with the Washington Post by holding off Snowden's threats to take the story elsewhere. Dark Mirror tells a story of journalism at its best. The story's bound to make you question how much privacy you really have and remind you of how critical good reporting is to our democracy. Bart, congratulations on your remarkable book. Jeffrey, I look forward to the discussion and turn it back to you.
Thank you, Mark and the Century Foundation. Before we dive into this conversation, I just want to remind our viewers that you can be part of this conversation. If you type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, I'll try to incorporate as many as I can into our discussion. Please keep your questions in the form of questions. That is always very useful. Keep them short and on topic, and tell us where you're watching from. That would be very useful as well. And now let me introduce Bart Gellman, so staff writer at The Atlantic, just recently joined us. Very excited about that. The book is Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State. And you can find an excerpt of it, an adapted excerpt of it on the Atlantic.com website right now. We're open 24 hours a day. It's an amazing thing. So Bart, welcome. Thanks for coming and doing this with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for hosting me. And I have to say one more thank you to Mark Zuckerman and the Century Foundation, which was my professional home for the whole period I was working on this book. And to you and The Atlantic for allowing me to join.
Oh, we're everybody's very happy. This is a very happy moment for all of us. Not in the happiest moment in American history, but the book is excellent, genuinely excellent. I'm not just saying that. All the President's Men analogy is interesting because when I first heard Mark talk about that, I was thinking about the technology that Woodward and Bernstein had to use to protect sources and the means of communication. If you remember famously, obviously, there was a flower pot that was moved on a balcony that would be the signal if Deep Throat would meet Woodward in a garage. And in reading your book, we've come quite a far way in terms of the ability and the sophistication and the complexity of sources and reporters meeting, gathering information, and so on. We can talk about that, or we can just write a master's thesis on that another time. But it is interesting how a 40-year gap or so changes everything. But let's start at the beginning, if you will. I'm going to try to keep this linear and chronological, but I'm not a very linear thinker, and I have literally 1 million questions for you. But take us to the moment when Edward Snowden, you don't know at the time is Edward Snowden, obviously, makes contact with you. Set that up for us and talk about how you realized, as a skeptical investigative journalist, that maybe there's something here.
Snowden appeared out of nowhere in the inbox of Laura Poitras, the filmmaker. And he called himself Virax, or Latin for truth teller, and actually a little bit of a dig at Julian Assange, who, by the way, had chosen the handle Mendax, which is the opposite, during his hacking years. And Virax told Laura Poitras that he was a member of the intelligence community. He had a scandal to expose. It had to do with surveillance, and was she interested? And she was, and she came to me within a couple of days. She actually flew from Germany to New York to talk to me about this, because she knew I had written about surveillance issues before, and we'd known each other. We were fellows together at NYU. And she told me that she had a spooky source who could give her a scandal about the NSA. And I was thinking to myself, oh boy, we're going down a rabbit hole with this one, because in my experience, there are very few subjects that are more conducive to spooky conspiratorial thinking. And after writing about surveillance in my last book, Angler, I had got a lot of voicemails and a lot of long, closely printed letters from crazy people, basically. But the more that I checked out this Virax, the better I liked the answers. He, and we somehow assumed it was a he, was precise in his language, careful about what he said, perfectly willing to say, I don't know, when I asked a question. And we had a long set of back and forths that were intended to establish bona fides on both sides. Snowden was very worried about me as a mainstream media representative, whether I and the Washington Post would have the balls to do a story like this, would bend to government pressure. And I wanted to know who he was and whether he was for real, whether he actually could know the things he was saying.
Could I just interrupt and ask, as a parenthetical, did you, when he asked that, did you say, you know, you're talking about the Washington Post, which published the Pentagon Papers and broke Watergate? I mean, it seems like an odd thing to ask of the Washington Post of all newspapers.
That was all in the distant past for him. And he had come to believe that you had to have an oppositional voice. You had to have someone who was an outward critic of the national security state, or you were not going to get the kind of fight that you needed in a publication.
Right. Well, and that was Laura, and that was Glenn Greenwald also, right?
Exactly.
Talk about the three of you as a team and a non-team, and the way he chose different people to give different information to, because I think that
I mean, Glenn Greenwald was his pugilist, and that was what he wanted, and he got exactly that. Glenn came a little bit late to the party because Snowden actually reached out to him first at the end of 2012 and the first days of 2013. And he sent him notes saying, please get an encryption key so I can talk to you securely. And Glenn, not knowing who this was or what they had to say, ignored it. So he came to Poitras second and he came to me third. And I think he was thinking like an engineer. He figured if one of us didn't do the story, another one would, and maybe we would have different perspectives. So let's just try all three at once.
I don't want you to rehearse the whole book because I want people to read the book, but I want to understand from inside your mind the different stages of your development in the story. In other words, okay, he passed some early tests for you, you passed some early tests for him, but at what point did you realize, oh my God, this guy, whoever he is, might have just run off with all of the crown jewels of the American intelligence establishment?
By the time I saw the first document from Snowden, I had had many hours of conversation with him, questions and answers and follow-ups and re-follow-ups. And by that point, I was pretty well convinced that what I was going to get would be real. But I had to worry a lot about authenticity, and I also had to worry about accuracy. That the document might have been authentic, but it might have been wrong. Those things exist. Or he might have misunderstood it, or I might misunderstand it. So, but by the time I got that first document, I thought it would be for real. When I saw it, I thought, wow, he really came through. This is not a figment of anyone's imagination. This is the real thing. I thought all along we were talking about one document. He never mentioned more. It was going to be one document. And the next day, the day after the first document came, 50,000 arrived.
Right.
That freaked me out.
Right. When you finally, and again, I'm gonna move quickly through the narrative here, but when you finally came to understand who he was, he outed himself, essentially. When you figured out who he was, were you comforted by finding out who he was, or did aspects of his life and his background make you more nervous about what you were getting involved in?
Well, it was comforting to have a name. I don't know that I could have gone with a story without knowing where it came from. And at the last moment, in fact, coincident with the first document he sent, he told us his name, his social security number, his CIA identification number, his CIA cover name, and so on, so that we could check him out. I was stunned at how young he was. And
how young was he at the time?
He was 29.
29.
He was 29 years old, and I was surprised by where he came from in the architecture of the intelligence community. First of all, that he was a contractor, not a government employee, although that should not have been surprising since contractors play such a big role. And then that he didn't come from the policy or the operational side. He came from the system administration side. And then, of course, it all fell into place, and you realize the sysadmin sees everything.
Right. Right. I mean, you're better off as a reporter. You're better off with the systems administrator guy than somebody who's siloed in one particular area of expertise. Right. Give us your first impressions of Snowden and his motivations, and maybe, again, you have to telescope a lot of stuff here, but tell us how your view of him, and particularly his motivations, changed over time.
He seemed to be an idealist. He seemed to have a pretty strong sense of right and wrong, and a pretty firm sense of what was right and what was wrong. He trusted his own ethical instincts. He obviously had that rare quality in which an individual says, it's not just that I disagree with this. I mean, any workplace, you find people who don't like what their bosses are doing. They're probably going to say nothing and get along and go along, because that's what most people do. They might say something internally. They might quit. They might ask for a transfer. What hardly anyone does is say, it's on me. It's my responsibility to bring this thing down.
This is a guy with a very Manichaean view of the world.
Right. There's a really interesting conversation in the book in which Ed Snowden and Daniel Ellsberg meet for the first time, virtually, like almost all his meetings. And Ellsberg is trying to figure out what makes him tick. why did you do this? Because I've been waiting for another whistleblower like me for 40 years. What is it about you that made you do it? And he couldn't get a good answer. And I think the answer is that he's a zealot, that he believes that what he understands to be right and wrong is right and wrong. He doesn't believe he's got some special access to truth. He thinks the truth is obvious to everyone and that you just aren't many people who are willing to look at it.
Right. What is the trigger? What was the trigger for him? I mean, there's obviously volumes and volumes of documents, but what was the thing that made him believe that the NSA in particular was participating in evil?
You know, he's told several variations of this story, and mostly he says, and I think accurately, that he can't pin it to one or two things. There was an accumulation of his sense that the US government was doing unethical things, that it was spying on people without justification, that it just went too far, that the volume of information that it was vacuuming up was so great, and its ability to catalog it was so great, that it gave too much power to the government vis-a-vis its people, and that it became a kind of a monster. He used the phrase turnkey tyranny, which was adapted from something Frank Church said back in the 70s. And essentially he was saying, you have built this extraordinarily powerful surveillance machine that could be abused with grievous results to democracy. And it just takes one turn of the key, one comma in legislation, one decision, one change in the code that puts constraints on the system, and you're there. And he thinks that was too dangerous to build and maintain.
Right. Let's go, because I want to make sure that our audience is reminded. Obviously, the book just came out today or yesterday. Was it actually released?
Today's the day.
Today's the day. I think Amazon shipped yesterday, but today's the official day. So obviously, most people who are watching this have not read it, and in our pandemic brains, we probably have blocked out a lot of information about even the recent past. So walk us through, just to table set here, the most extraordinary revelations that you wrote about based on the documents that he leaked.
So the very first story that came out said that the NSA was collecting records of just about every telephone call made in the United States. That means your calls, my calls, not terrorist calls, everyone's calls, whether it was down the street or across the country or around the world. These were records of who called whom and when and how long they talked, and so on. And these are called metadata. And the government argues that there's no big privacy interest in metadata, but that's nonsense. They tell an intimate portrait of everyone's life and social networks and who's connected to whom and so on.
But explain that just for a minute. I mean, the theory, and you outline this very nicely in the book, but the theory is essentially that I can learn a lot about you by knowing who is in your network and who you're calling and what time you're calling and where you are when you call, something like that, right?
Yeah, I would literally rather on any given day that somebody spy on the words that I say than that they gather all the metadata about me, because you can put together a complete portrait of my life, and you can't hide metadata. You can't spoof them. You know, if I want to be discreet on the telephone, I don't have to say the words, but I can't help emitting locations and dialing information and who do I email with and what pages do I browse and so on. It's harder to have a private self that way.
Right. So the US government is basically gathering metadata on everyone, including Americans.
Yes.
Talk about other revelations that came out in the course of this.
So the next one was that the US government had hooks into every large American internet company and had free access to information stored about you or about anyone in Google or Yahoo or Microsoft or AOL or Facebook. It had been the case until 2008 that the government had to get an individual warrant for every account it obtained. Now, I mean, sometimes intelligence services should be able to go to Google and say, give me everything in the account that you have about so-and-so. It used to be that you had to get a warrant for that, about that individual. They changed the program so that they could be doing 100,000 of these things at once without a judge getting involved, without a judge even knowing who was being surveilled.
Right.
There was just a set of rules agreed that said, here's how you can pull information from Facebook and Microsoft. That was called PRISM, the PRISM program. And that was the second big revelation. But the revelations that meant the most to me, that I've spent most of my time on, I think were the least understood. Because after those first two stories, which government officials agreed, well, reluctantly, they would agree that these were things that maybe there should have been public debate about. They are happening domestically, domestic phone calls, domestic internet data. But all the rest of Snowden's disclosures, all the rest of those stories that Gellman wrote and Greenwald and Poitras, those were about legitimate, lawful foreign intelligence operations that took place overseas, and there was no reason to disclose them. And what my work was trying to show was that was false, that because of the way telecommunications work now, every communication goes everywhere. If I send an email to you on the side while we're having this conversation, it's going to probably end up in Singapore because Google has a very large data center there. It has data centers on every populated continent. They balance the load on the internet. They store backup copies. And so just because you collect something overseas doesn't mean that it's collecting against a foreigner. You are actually very likely, if you do bulk collection overseas, to be sweeping in millions or tens of millions of Americans. And those were the stories that I thought were the most interesting.
Well, let me just play devil's advocate for a second, something we've talked about. There's this great expression in your book by a national security official who says, you know, you can't, and I'm paraphrasing, but you can't find a needle in a haystack if you don't have a haystack. The haystack is this data, right? And so if you're looking for terrorist plots and you don't even know the size and shape or the existence of the haystack, how are you going to find a terrorist plot? And so I guess the question is, what would you have the NSA do to uncover malefactors who are hiding in these mountains and mountains of data? And what would you have the NSA do? Because the new I mean, as you point out, in the old days, the Soviet Union had closed communication systems. When you spied on a Soviet communication system, you knew that Americans weren't getting caught up in that communication system. But now everything is one thing. So, like, what would you say to them? What would you have them do that they felt they couldn't do?
Okay, well, first of all, everyone should be glad that I'm not in charge of this. Well,
we'll go back to that, but maybe you should be. But anyway, we'll go back.
Believe me, I shouldn't.
Yeah.
There's a couple of answers to that. First of all, there's a fundamental difference between bulk collections and targeted collections. And I'll come back to that. Second of all, let's not fall into the trap of thinking that most of this is about terrorism. Terrorism is one important piece of the intelligence requirements, but there's
certainly part of the main post-2001 rationale for all of these programs.
Well, rationale, yes, the public rationale. But if you want to talk about what the largest parts of the NSA's take are, their foreign relations, their economic data about foreign countries, their the full span of interest that any nation state has in the world about enemies and also about friends. So it's not all terrorism by a long shot, and it does change your thinking a little bit. There are times when it's useful to them to collect a gigantic pile and use advanced data procedures to find insights in that pile. That doesn't mean that they should be allowed to do it. It would be useful if you're conducting a police investigation to search every house on the block and turn everyone's pockets inside out, but we don't allow that because we want to draw lines and you want to have some sense of a predicate for a search like that. And so the NSA wants to do things now that never in human history could any entity do it. You couldn't have complete knowledge of every communication on the planet. The NSA can't quite get there yet, but it's heading in that direction. And it's not clear that you need that in order to advance the interests of the United States to do a good enough job of knowing that nothing is perfect and knowing that there are other interests at stake here.
Right. Let me ask you this, because I think this is an area where you might differ with Snowden. Snowden might talk about these issues in Manichaean terms, good and evil. I'm not sure in reading your book that you think that what the NSA did and does is quote unquote evil. I read your book and came to understand that there is almost a bureaucratic imperative. It's an organization that is mandated by the American government to collect information about adversaries to protect American interests. It has tools to collect that information. It's only natural. I mean, help me out here. I'm trying to understand this. The argument that the NSA shouldn't do this is an argument that no bureaucratic organization can easily sort of absorb. Like, they are there to collect information. If they have the technical means to collect it, it's very, very hard to get an organization to stop doing that. That's what it's there for. You get what I'm saying?
No, absolutely. First of all, I don't think it's evil. I don't think it's bad faith. I think some of the things that they say to the public, believing that the public can't understand or would respond badly, some of the things they say to the public are dishonest. And some of the things that they have said have been flat out lies. And that goes for the NSA, it goes for the FBI, it goes for other aspects of government across the board. There are times when you don't trust the public in a position like that to do the thing that you think it needs to do. But they believe they're working for us. And yeah, they are held to a standard in which any big event that happens, they should have been able to predict or detect or prevent, depending on what the event is. And if year after year after year, you're called and hauled before a congressional committee and told, why we have warning about this? How dare you say you're doing a good job and you didn't predict this happening? Then there's no tool that they will set aside and say, we don't need this one. We've come up with a cool way of doing something. We're responding to requirements set by the national leadership, which is to tell us everything you can possibly find out about Putin or about Merkel, for that matter.
Right.
They're gonna do everything they can. That doesn't mean that we should, as a society, feel good about that.
Well, this goes to another question, which is the NSA is there. I mean, and you're exactly right. I mean, if you're an NSA leader and a terrorist attack occurs, congressional leadership, the media, the public blame you, and you say, well, my hands are tied because I didn't have this tool or that tool. Nobody's going to care about that. So it's almost like they'd rather have Bart Gellman being critical of them on this hand and being able to collect everything than the reverse. But the question has to do with who's watching them. I mean, these programs came up in ostensibly a system that has checks and balances. There's ostensibly, putatively, congressional oversight over this. How did it happen that an enormous American intelligence agency just started collecting about everybody with impunity, and might still be doing it today had Snowden not done what he did?
Let me answer that. There's one last point I want to make about the last subject, which is you can't assume that the most comprehensive collection is actually effective. The argument made for collecting all the call records of all Americans was that it would help find terrorists. And eventually, finally, subjected to outside scrutiny of a third party that had classified access, it came to light that this program had never actually detected a terrorist plot that had previously been unknown. So it doesn't always mean that it's effective, but
still, on balance, if you were running one of these agencies, you'd rather know more than less.
Right, you'd rather know more than less. You know, if you could capture a complete record of every word spoken or typed or transmitted by humankind, you would do it. If you could build a thought reading machine, you would do it. We can't blind ourselves to the thoughts of others when they might be thinking bad thoughts that are going to hurt us. That sounds ridiculous, but it's exactly the same argument.
Right.
You had another question, which I've just let slip from my mind.
Oh, it slipped my mind too. I'll come back to that because I want to do I want to do a couple of questions from our one is very much related to this, and I want you to go into it a little bit more. This is from Kristen Glover. Snowden has been accused by the U.S. government as well as much of the mainstream press of being a traitor, guilty of revealing top secrets, and this is the point, endangering U.S. troops, endangering physical U.S. persons, as the expression goes. How do you know for sure that no one was endangered by these leaks?
I don't know that for sure. It's not possible to know that. No one could claim to know that. I am quite confident that there was damage. I personally doubt that there were people who were placed physically in harm's way because of these leaks. I believe that there were losses of collection. Now, some of them may have been losses.
What does loss of collection mean?
I mean that the NSA did not intercept information that would have been relevant or interesting to intelligence agencies that it otherwise would have intercepted. That one day it had a productive view of some stream of communication by some foreign actor, and the next day, because of the Snowden leaks, it did. And I think that must be true, although those facts would also be classified, so I can't know them. I don't know them. Right. But you have to think about, why did they lose this visibility? It might have been because Americans and citizens around the world got very upset and worried about the extent of the intrusion on their privacy and demanded more privacy. And then internet companies like Google and Microsoft and Yahoo started encrypting their connections. So the internet companies said, wait a minute, you know, no one spies on our customers but us. We can't allow our data centers to be compromised this way. We're going to start encrypting that traffic. Right. Now, if the NSA loses coverage that way, is that a feature or a bug? Right? I mean, that is the free market operating as it's supposed to, with consumers demanding more privacy, right, and companies giving them more. If a rebellion in Congress leads to a vote in which some of the NSA surveillance is no longer lawful, then they can't do it anymore. They've lost collection. But that's the political system working the way it's supposed to do.
Right. That was the question. You don't have to do a long peroration on it, though we could spend hours on this. But the question is, where was Congress during all of this?
That was your question. Well, there's a well-studied phenomenon of regulatory capture, in which regulators and committees that regulate the regulators start joining the club, thinking like the people that they are supposed to be holding accountable. And you had people on inside these closed worlds. They call it the high side, the world in which everything is classified. And they trusted themselves. The programs made sense to them. They could see why the information was useful. No one ever said, wow, this is terrible what we're doing. And they didn't have any outside perspective on it. And you also had judges who were hearing only the government side. That's the way ex parte proceedings work in a court like the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And so when the FBI came in on behalf of the NSA and made the following argument, the court said, okay, so the FBI said, we have a law that allows us to collect business records that are relevant to an authorized terrorism investigation. Relevance is usually used to limit the scope of the information that you obtain. This is relevant, that's not. They said, if we have a terrorism investigation, because there might be an unknown terrorist, therefore, every telephone call made by anyone in America is relevant, and we should be able to collect it. Right. And a court said, sure, that sounds good to me. Mm-hmm. It's a wild idea that was in the middle of being knocked down in appellate courts when Congress just outlawed the program.
Right. Let me ask you two other quick questions, and I want to go to a couple of more questions from our audience. One question, and it's a serious question. It sounds a little bit mischievous, but did Snowden do the intelligence community a favor? Because if you step back from this, there's a kind of cosmic joke embedded in this story, which is that here's the most sophisticated intelligence agency in the history of the world and a 29-year-old contractor at a secondary facility in Hawaii, right? Not even in the headquarters building, walks out with all of the jewels. I mean, did he prove essentially that the NSA was incompetent at holding its own secrets, and which might have then led them to become better at doing what they do?
Yeah, I think computer monitors all over America are exploding from whoever's watching this from the intelligence community would not feel good about that. There's an enormous.
But it's literally true that he did just walk out with all the stuff.
Yeah, the NSA's core mission is called information dominance. They're supposed to protect American secrets and steal the secrets of others. Those are the two main parts of the NSA. And they were completely upended by a relatively uneducated, actually more precisely, a self-educated.
An autodidact, yeah.
Genius. I mean, the guy's intelligence is off the charts. He had enormous discipline and guts and operational planning capability, and he was apparently quite good technically. And yeah, he stole the crown jewels over a long period of time while talking to journalists and while, sort of wearing civil libertarian sweatshirts into work and making everyone read the Constitution with him. So, I mean, let's just say that they're a little more aware of internal security threats.
Right. Let me ask you a turnkey tyranny question. You can't help but read this book without thinking about who is currently the president. I mean, most of what happens in this book is in the Obama administration, or much of it. Thinking about that and thinking about the fact that your adversaries in this book, General Hayden, General Clapper, the heads of the intelligence community, and who you, in a very, very lively, interesting way, are debating throughout this book, they have become, in the last years, and people like John Brennan and all the rest, they have become part of the resistance. They're dissenters now. They look at Donald Trump as a tyrannical figure. Their reputations and where they moved are so interesting compared to where they were when they were trying to keep the Snowden secrets from getting into your hands, for instance, and calling him a traitor and calling even you an accomplice to a traitor. Give us your thinking about where we are in that. I mean, are you surprised at the turn that they've made, or in their universe, does it just make sense?
I'm actually have to say I'm gratified at the turn that many of them have made, because they thought what they were doing was so obvious, so clearly honorable and necessary for Americans. They trusted themselves to use these enormous powers they had given themselves, that they just couldn't see the problem. They couldn't see the question. They couldn't see why there would be any legitimate debate. They weren't willing to say that Snowden had raised a legitimate debate by and large. And I go through many scenes in this book of conversations I have with people who are at the top of those establishments who are thinking again now in the age of Trump. They finally see the point that you can trust yourself. You could trust the leadership that you have now. You could trust the leadership that we've always had. There were many of them who said, I trusted Barack Obama, I trusted George Bush, I trusted every president I ever worked for to do the right thing on this fundamentally. And they now have a president who is not interested in any way in the legal restraints that bind him, in the norms and the traditions that have restrained the use of these tools, who tends to project, and so that if he accuses someone of something, it probably means he's either done it or thought about doing it, and is talking all the time about secret surveillance and spying.
Right.
as if he's been the victim.
Right.
So, I mean, so Jim Clapper, who literally called me an accomplice to a crime, which has legal meaning and could have caused my prosecution, tells me over a very long breakfast, at a CIA hangout in Northern Virginia, that he's not so sure as he used to be about the system, about whether it's sufficiently safeguarded, and he's not sure what to do about that.
A question from Hugh from Staten Island. We're in drive time radio now. Hugh from Staten Island wants to know, what are the ethics of whistleblowing? Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's really interesting.
And there's a related question. You could deal with them in the same. Bob from Amsterdam asks, how can we determine which level of government surveillance would be acceptable? I mean, and they're two sides of the same coin.
Well, one thing that would help determine whether a level of surveillance is acceptable is if it's accepted, is if it's actually been publicly debated. If the intelligence community, if the government comes to Congress and says, we think we should be able to do this, but not that, this, but not that, and we're prepared to accept this kind of oversight, these kind of restraints. You can't have a plebiscite on every intelligence operation. And there are lots of things that are secret and have to be secret from the public. But the fundamental boundaries of intelligence in a democratic society can be debated and need to be. I myself would be much more interested in a world in which surveillance were targeted on individual groups, individual foreign government entities, individual people that they have reason to suspect.
You believe that there's a role for spying?
Yeah, I
Does
do.
Edward Snowden believe that there's a role for spying?
I've heard him ask that question, and he says he does.
Yeah.
And he, by the way, his rhetoric varies. He does not usually talk about the NSA in terms of evil. He thinks the people he worked with were people of good faith trying to do a good job, but working within a system that they didn't sufficiently question.
Right. Right. Let me merge two other questions for you. They're again, maybe two sides of the same coin. The first is, some are suspicious of Snowden's relationship with Putin and Russia. Are those suspicions warranted? And the second question has to do with how Snowden is going to be understood over time by Americans. In other words, is there a chance that this is a guy who one day will be understood to be a hero by a large number of Americans? And obviously the answer to number two has a lot to do with whether number one, there's salience to number one.
Right. Well, first of all, Russia. A lot of people ask the question. It's natural to be curious. It's natural to be suspicious. What is this guy doing in Russia? And it's important to understand, and that's a question that interested me too, by the way. And if I had found any shred of evidence that he went there as a Russian agent, that he were cooperating with Moscow, that he were trying to work to the detriment of our own government vis-a-vis the Russian government, anything like that, I would have considered that huge news and highly desirable to nail down and to publish. And I didn't. He's in Russia because he was trapped there by accident. It was an accident on everybody's part. The State Department canceled his passport in hope of keeping him in Hong Kong, but he was already on a plane. And his plane he was supposed to change planes in Moscow for an onward flight that would have taken him to Ecuador. I've seen the flight receipts. I know what his ticket was for. The passport is canceled. He gets to Russian passport control. They say, the computer says this thing's not valid anymore. You can't leave. And he's stuck in the airport for 40 days. He did not aim to go to Russia, but in order to prevent damage, he destroyed the encryption keys to the documents before he went to Russia. So he was literally incapable of opening or retrieving the keys to open the documents. Once he gave them to the journalists, he no longer possessed them himself. So he couldn't hand them over to Russia. He doesn't need financial support from the Russian government. I know how he makes his money.
How does he make his money?
Well, first of all, he got, as he told me in the book, enough Bitcoin to last until the fucking sun dies, from contributions from Silicon Valley, from people who were outraged at the things he disclosed and wanted to support him. He's got a job as the head of a foundation. He gives paid speeches all the time. He lives simply. It's not hard for him to support himself without resorting to Russian government cash. And Putin has good reason to leave him be, because he's a useful symbol for Putin. Putin gets to play the host to a human rights fighter and a civil liberties advocate, railing against the injustice of the United States, and he enjoys that role.
Right. And go to the second part, and we'll end on this. It's while he's sitting in Moscow these many years, do you think that the American public's understanding of what he did will shift? I mean, if Clapper is shifting a little bit in light of what has now happened in American politics, in part, do you think that there's a chance that 10 or 15 years from now, people will say, you know, what Snowden did was not spying. He was leaking information that the American people had a right to know?
I think things are tending a little bit in that direction. My crystal ball is not very good, but Snowden was responsible for securing the internet. The internet is a much, much more secure place for you to do financial transactions, for you to confide personal secrets, for you to make business plans, for you to do all the things that we do with this fully connected society. It is more secure by far because of him, and anyone in government who knows this subject, and anyone in private sector who knows this subject would say, yes, that's true. I was very surprised that over a course of months and years, I had a final conversation with Jim Comey after he left as FBI director, in which he said, kind of reluctantly, that Snowden probably did more good than harm. That was shocking for me to hear from him, and I think that it's certainly my view, and I think it may become the consensus over time.
We'll leave it there. Like I said, there are a million questions that I'd love to ask, and we'll do another one of these soon, I hope. The book is, and I'm not just saying this, the book is actually gripping. And one of Bart's gifts as a writer is to explain things that otherwise you might not understand. I'm not very technically minded. I now have a much better idea of what the NSA does, and how it does it, and how Snowden did what he did. So it's definitely worth reading. Any citizen should read this book. Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State is the book. Bart Gellman, staff writer of The Atlantic, is the author. It is officially out today. Congratulations to Bart, and thanks for being with us. And thanks again to our friends at the Century Foundation. And thanks to all of you in our audience for watching. Please subscribe to The Atlantic, and please come back for more of these events. Next Thursday, May 28th, the next installment of our digital series, The Big Story. My colleagues, The Atlantic's executive editor, Adrienne LaFrance, will join our deputy editor, Jillian White, to discuss Adrienne's new cover story on QAnon and the history of conspiracy theories in America. It's an amazing story. You can find it at theatlantic.com or in print if you can get yourself to a newsstand safely, if you're not a subscriber. And it's going to be an amazing conversation, and we hope to see you next week for that. And thank you very, very much for watching. Appreciate it. Bye.